Hi everyone, welcome. Over here on the top shelf, you're going to see a bin that has the harvested castings from 2 European nightcrawler worm bins, a couple systems that were harvested 26 days ago, and the harvested castings have not yet been put to use. They've been placed into this tub here, consolidated into a single tub, so that we could try to round up any remaining straggler worms that were not successfully rounded up and hauled out 26 days ago, which was when we used those initially hauled out worms to launch 3 buckets. They're the buckets that were placed down here into the yellow buckets labeled as numbers 3, 4, and 5. And 12 days have passed now since we last checked in on these little guys to give them a feeding. And up here in the consolidated bin of castings where we're attempting to round up stragglers, I've revisited this container on 3 occasions now to aerate the material, and while doing so just pick out any worms that I encounter along the way to place them into this bait box over here. And every time I aerate the material, I assume I'm making it less and less hospitable for worms to want to remain in, hopefully inspiring them to go find something better. And then that something better is the nicely dampened, nicely stocked with food and fresh bedding, the bait box. So, but now after 26 days, I believe enough time has probably passed to bring that baiting effort to an end, haul out the last of the stragglers, and introduce them to the rest of the crowd that was moved out 26 days ago. It'll be a little bit of a family reunion, and then we can make some more space up there on the shelf. So I'm going to get a glove on, get these systems up on the bench, and get this show on the road. So let's get started. Some of the information that we jotted down here on this information board has already been covered, such as the age of the yellow buckets, 26 days now, and the amount of time that's passed since the second feeding 12 days ago. Feeding number 1 was really already waiting for the worms in the yellow buckets. They were pre-built with food. So today's feeding number 3 is going to include asparagus, apple peels, and the last of these little biscuit pastries. And it's got a good bit of weight to it, so each of the 3 buckets is going to get its fair share of that portion of food. And one of the fun things that we do when we launch videos here on my channel is based on viewer feedback and comments. I take everyone's estimates of how many worms they thought we launched into any one of my systems, and we average them. So my estimate combined with viewer feedback results in the estimated worm count of my systems. So what we're left with here are 3 systems which have an interesting averaged amount of worms living in them, where bucket number 3 is thought to have the fewest number of worms. Add 50, that's what gets you to the estimated worm count for bucket number 4, and then add another 50, that gets you to the estimated worm count of bucket number 5. So my idea was that we would just take what's in the bait box, divide it up into 3 equal portions, and it would be kind of cool if the larger of the portions would be 2/3 of the container, which might have 100 worms living in it, and then the remaining third might have 50. So if it's 50, 50, 50, we take 100, put it into the least populated system, upping its worm count to match the highest populated bucket, and then take the remaining 50, add it to the middle system, also bringing its number up to match the highest populated bucket. And then we would end up with something new here, which is similar to what we've had in the past. Sometimes I consider systems that have an equal number of worms in them as twin bins, or twin systems when there's 2 of them, but I've not yet had 3 systems with a worm population thought to be the same in all 3. So it'd be kind of cool if we had triplet buckets here. But I guess that really relies on us having 150 worms rounded up in here, and well, we'll have to see. It's time to dive in and check in on this bait box, see how it's progressing. It's been 26 days, and during that 26 days, I've come in here 3 times to aerate. The last of those aerations was 6 days ago. So I think that covers all the info on the board here. Why don't we set this aside and get to work? So, typically my aeration would consist of me simply removing this, checking the bottom just to see if there's any worms stuck to it. And then typically it's right here underneath the bait box that I expect the material to be the most damp, because everything out here exposed to the air is sort of left to dry. And then my aerations really consist of blending all this dry material in with the rest of the stuff down below. And what I've noticed during these aeration check-ins was that each time it seemed like we were getting fewer and fewer worms, and each time it also seemed like the material in the system was getting more and more crumbly and loose, getting less and less damp and clumpy and muddy. But I think before we sort of write this off as a done deal, we'll just do a quick courtesy check just to see if we can, by chance, run into any straggler worms. And here and there I bump into something like a pumpkin seed or whatever. I'll just extract that too and keep it with the worms, because, you know, what we're looking for here is a nice clean batch of castings, free of debris if possible, ideally free of worms too. Not that there's a big problem with worms being in here. They would just end up getting released out into the garden when the time comes to use these castings. And in the past I've had pretty good luck running these straggler setups to round up any worms left behind from initial haul outs, gradually giving the material a chance to dry off, become a little bit more manageable in terms of its crumbliness, if that's a word. And that would kind of pave the way if I really wanted to. I could always run this stuff through a screen, and then it would help me, you know, isolate any sort of larger little sticks, stems, food chunks that still remain in here, leftovers. I mean, here, for example, this looks to me like the stem of a pepper. Every time I bump into something that looks like that, I simply throw it over there into the bait box, keep it with the worms rather than leaving it as debris in the batch of castings. But I think we're pretty much at the end of the road here in terms of these castings. I see no stragglers. In most check-ins, I do try to go all the way to the bottom to see what I can see, because a lot of times worms do find little pockets of moisture down deep as they try to evade the dryness encroaching from above. But you know, on this go around I've not seen one, not even a single worm. It's usually at times like this that I bite my tongue because I am proven wrong by encountering some worms. But on this go around, it does seem like we've managed at this point to completely depopulate this lovely batch of castings, at the same time giving it a chance to dry off enough to make it really nice and smooth flowing. Every time I would come in here to aerate and also pick out a worm or two as I encountered them, I would also, as I've been doing here, remove food bits and food scraps, and at the same time also crumbling material that would tend to want to stick together, possibly due to excessive moisture, all helping us get to a really nice batch of material here. So I think the time has come to write this system off now. The baiting is complete. I think before we wrap up here, the best thing to do would be to simply bring this thing back and try to size up how many worms we've got here, because as we always do, we're going to be looking to you guys as the viewers to provide me with some feedback on how many worms we're releasing into the buckets. Like I mentioned earlier, it would be kind of neat if we can just sort of take about 2/3 of what's in here, which would be ideally equating to about 100 or so worms, and clearly a lot of springtails too, and drop them into the least populated system, bucket number 3. And then also take the remaining, possibly 50 worms, drop them into bucket number 4, and then that would bring the numbers of all those systems to match the most populated bucket, which is bucket number 5. So it almost does seem to me like we might have about 150 or so worms living in this bait box. It might not seem like a huge haul, but it always does seem to me like a nice idea to try to round up stragglers and keep them with the family, and at the same time also giving a little bit of extra time to any possible cocoons that might have been left behind in the material, so that possibly some cocoons that might have been on the verge of being ready to release their payload and drop some little baby worms into the material can do so with that extra time, and then those little babies can also be reunited with the rest of the family. So I think we're done here. That makes it official. This batch of castings is now worm free, ready for use out in the garden, and now it's time to release these little guys. Oops, we did get a little escapee here. Let's get this guy back with the rest of the gang. So it's time to release these little guys into the buckets number 3 and 4, while we go in there to feed them. So let's get to work on that. So now what these little guys received as a feeding during the last check-in 12 days ago was a little bit of an oddball feeding. It was a few pitas, a couple of I think, yeah, each system got a pita, so I just tore the pita up into little pieces and I dampened it with my spray bottle. And I usually don't really feed a lot of bread type foods, so I, in a way, don't know exactly what to expect. So I'm curious, definitely curious to see if there's going to be any leftovers of it, or have they gone ahead and consumed it all. It would be nice to think that they've consumed it all. So far, I'm not really seeing anything. The stuff would have been definitely placed right down the middle. And if there were leftovers, I would assume that we would be able to identify it amidst this beddings and, you know, this collection of different types of beddings here. Mainly cardboard and paper, maybe some leaves in here too. And a lot of castings piling up. I figured we'd be able to spot a couple chunks of leftover pita if there were still some in here. Or maybe even some mold that would have been growing on it in case it would have been tough to identify. But if over here, in the least populated of the 3 systems, we're seeing none, it's probably fair to assume that all 3 buckets have done away with the pita that they were fed last time. So that's good. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, feeding a type of food that I typically don't give my wormies. So I'm glad that they enjoyed it, and I'm glad that they were able to do away with it pretty quickly. So I think it's time to give them their fair shake of yummy foods, and at the end we'll drop in what I will attempt to partition out 2/3 of the rounded up worms in that bait box, along with the bedding in there. Possibly, you know, giving this system a boost of its population by maybe 100 worms or so. I think that would be kind of neat if we did end up with triplet bins here. So this feeding, I guess, if we divide it up 3 ways, would probably consist of about what I see down in here. Not a terribly huge feeding, but I think they'll appreciate it. I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell too. And I was just debating on whether we want to add more bedding. I just pulled up a whole bunch of unused or seemingly unused bedding from the bottom, which is kind of cool. And I'll admit I didn't set myself up over here with bedding, so I'm not on the ready with bedding. So you know what, why don't we skip bedding today? I'll definitely include it in future check-ins, but it does seem to me by kind of stirring stuff around here we've managed to unearth a good bit of bedding that the wormies can make use of. And, you know, with this thing being only 26 days of age, I think there's a fair bit of residual bedding in here for the worms to utilize. So if this system here has maybe, well, this bait box, if this bait box has 150 worms in it, and if I treat it as 50-50-50, and if I take 2/3 of it, then perhaps what we're going to end up with here is about 100 worms being added to bucket number 3. So I'll do my best to transfer this material into here in such a way that you can catch a glimpse of what we're doing. I know that a lot of what we're bringing over is obscured and all mixed together, so it's a little bit tricky to see, but perhaps I'll be able to get some feedback from you guys on how many worms you think we just added here. I know what I'm guessing. And I might be biased because I'm loving the idea of having triplet buckets. Not that it's all that important. So whatever remains here of these worms in the bait box are going to be transferred over into bucket number 4, but over here in bucket number 3 I think we're done. Giving them a feeding, giving them some grit, giving them a little boost to their population size. And that brings us to the next system to be fed, bucket number 4. So now I'm carefully trying to lift and move 3 buckets at once here. And it seems like I managed to pull that off with creating any sort of a calamity, so bravo. Now, as I usually do, I'll typically treat the first of multiple bins as my exploratory check, and then follow through with the remainder of the systems, assuming that we're in store for very similar results, because systems that are being managed pretty much identically should be sort of a cookie cutter. So number 1 assumption is that we're not going to find leftover pita bread in here, and I believe that that's kind of what we're seeing, although I am tending to excavate out to the edges rather than straight down the middle, which is where the pita bread was placed. I guess we could just do a quick little till up down the middle too, just to see what we see, but I think what we expected was pretty much no leftovers from last time, and we pretty much confirmed what the expectation was. And then we can come in here with another 1/3 of the yummy foods that we came down here with for them. Yummy asparagus and apple peels, and we're going to attempt to save the remaining 1/3, hopefully an equal 1/3 portion, for the last bucket, into which no additional worms will be placed because that's the one that was thought to have the greatest number of worms living in it. And now it's time to release the last of the stragglers. And I guess we could just do that by sort of dumping it out and just making sure we've not left anyone behind. Oh, I see one little guy over here. And you know, I think it would be fair to give you guys a somewhat better view of what we just dropped in here. Let's see if we could stir it around a little bit and check out what we see. Definitely a good many springtails came along for the ride too. And how many worms we just dropped in, I don't know. But I will be entering my estimate into my spreadsheet, and I'd love to enter your estimate as well. So please, for the last 2 systems where we just added worms, please be sure to leave me a comment. Let me know how many worms you think we just added to buckets number 3 and 4. And now we can move on to feeding bucket number 5. Okay, oh, a little bit more room over here. Okay. Once again, I'm employing the cookie cutter thinking here. Assuming that we're going to find no leftovers, we're going to find a good bit of bedding, and then we'll drop in the food. Like I said, this was the system thought by all of us in our estimates to have the greatest number of worms living in it. So wouldn't be too surprising if we saw what might appear to be a few more worms than what we saw in the first two buckets. And I guess depending on how our estimates come up for the added worms in buckets number 3 and 4, we might end up with no system that has a advantage over any other with more worms in it. But I guess that really remains to be seen based on what everyone's feedback is. And you know, I'm kind of having a little bit of a blank in my mind. Drawing a blank on whether or not we added grit to the feeding we applied in bucket number 4, the last one we just did. I don't know, did we sprinkle in pulverized eggshell into bucket number 4? I don't know. I do my best to keep things in sync, but sometimes I'm not really paying attention because I'm so caught up in trying to speak what's on my mind that I often skip steps. But I guess I can always take a quick peek into bucket number 4, see what's down in the feeding area. If I don't see any signs of eggshell, I can always sprinkle a little bit in. So I think that brings us to the check-in now with our now 26-day-old yellow buckets with the European night crawlers, bringing an end to the baiting of the harvested castings, and that's always a nice thing. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.